For me, child psychiatry and mental health has been a passion. Part of what occurs as well in a household like that is you become a person who can feel other people's emotions because you have to, right? You need to know when things are about to not be good. And so if you think about a child who has a mental health concern, many of them don't have necessarily the words to express how they're doing, but there's the emotion there. And so for me, especially in my work as a child psychiatrist, it's helped me to understand how a child is feeling. I'm able to tune into their emotions and really tap into their situation.
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosenman Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
In honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, we are thrilled to kick off a special 2-part interview series with Dr. Monika Roots. She's the leader in mental health, tirelessly working to enhance care through innovative technology and strong partnership. Dr. Roots co-founded Bend Health, where she serves as president, applying her extensive 16-year experience in psychiatry, primarily focused on children and teens, to revolutionize mental health services. Growing up with a first-hand experience of bipolar disorder in her family, Dr. Roots was inspired to ensure emotional safety for others, especially children. This connection to mental health challenges fuels her passion and dedication to her work. Dr. Roots has been a pioneer in integrating technology with traditional mental health care. Her initiatives have expanded access to mental health services and emphasized the importance of preventive care, tackling issues before they escalate. Today, she'll share her insights on how innovation in psychiatry can support comprehensive care models that benefit both young patients and their families. Her story is a powerful reminder of how empathy and creativity can solve critical healthcare challenges. Join us as we explore Dr. Roots' visionary work and her relentless commitment to transforming mental health care, which is especially touching during this month and dedicated to raising awareness about mental health. Here's our conversation. Welcome, Monika. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's looking forward to our conversation. And one thing that I always like to ask a lot of our guests is about their background story, their journey, what brought you to where you are today. And you mentioned earlier in our separate conversation that you grew up in Brazil. So, how has that land you where you are in this land of opportunity, as we call it?
So my mom was the youngest of 6, and she grew up in a town in Brazil called Belo Horizonte, which is maybe one of the biggest cities you've never heard of. It's about 4 to 5 million people. And her siblings, all of the girls, came to the U.S. and the boys stayed behind with my grandma. And my mom was the last one to come over. So by that point, there were 4 women in the United States and 2 of the boys in Brazil. She was then set up on a blind date, which was actually her sister's husband's best friend, who turned out to be my father. And months later, they were married. And then I was born in Minnesota, but my mom really brought me up in a very multicultural home, really emphasizing our Brazilian heritage and culture. And so I would go back to Brazil often to be where most of my extended family is.
And so what brought you to do the work that you're doing right now?
It's really been a lifelong series of events that really have led me to where I am today. It probably starts from a very young age. So as I did mention, my mom brought me up in a really multicultural home, but she also unfortunately suffered from something called bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder, for those who may be familiar, means that you have really low lows and really high highs. And I was an only child. And so I grew up in a household where sometimes it didn't feel emotionally safe. And one of the responses to trauma is something called fawn, where you really do anything necessary to make the other person feel better. And that was really how I learned to manage my situation, which was, what did I have to do to make her feel safe and calm so that she could feel better? That then grew into a lifelong passion for performance and music, because if you think about that again, it's really a performance to make other people feel better. That was really my intended goal, was to be a professional musician. And I was always good at science. That was just something that always came naturally to me. So I grew up in Santa Cruz. I went to Aptos High School. And my second year, my sophomore year in high school, my chemistry professor said, I'm going to nominate you for something called the National Youth Forum on Medicine. And it actually happened at UCSF. I said, no, I'm not really interested in medicine. I don't think I need to go. And he said, well, too bad. You're the only one I'm going to nominate. So I went to this forum and I was able to really meet a lot of doctors who are making a difference, especially someone named Patch Adams, who really created the environment to help those who are in need, and he would not charge for his services.
Wasn't there a movie with Robin Williams?
Absolutely. And I met the real Patch Adams. I read his book, but I was able to speak with him personally. And in speaking to me, he said, no, this is what you have to do. And so eventually I went on to be a psychology major, went to medicine, and kids have always been a passion of mine, especially talking to them, understanding their story as well as the families. And I think part of that harkens back to really having an understanding of how a child may feel in a situation where mental health may be a concern.
And so you mentioned when you say, like, based on the you want to make your mom feel better through performance. Is that what people talk about, the people pleaser? Is that different?
Exactly. So there's 4 responses to trauma. It's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So fight, obviously you get irritable and angry. Flight, you run away and you really don't want to deal with it. Freeze is you're just stuck in the moment and don't know what to say and don't move and don't react. But the last one is called fawn, which is you do what is necessary to make the other person feel better. And if you think about it, what you're doing is setting your emotions aside to help someone else. It's a little like a performance, but the side effect of it is to make everything okay so you feel better.
And how has that affected your work now with the experience that you have?
For me, child psychiatry and mental health has been a passion. I think that part of what occurs as well in a household like that is you become a person who can feel other people's emotions because you have to, right? You need to know when things are about to not be good. Mm-hmm. And so if you think about a child who has a mental health concern, many of them don't have necessarily the words to express how they're doing, but there's the emotion there. And so for me, especially in my work as a child psychiatrist, it's helped me to understand how a child is feeling. I'm able to tune into their emotions and really tap into their situation. And I think that having empathy and learned experience helps you understand where that child, and also honestly, the caregivers and the families of where they're coming from. And so really understanding the family system has impacted my work today.
And so when you're thinking about the family system with the child, oftentimes the child went through because of the family situation. How do you navigate that when they have the trauma and oftentimes it's caused by the family and the family needs to be there to support the child?
Yeah. I think that's one of the faults of pediatric mental health today, which is in many cases, a child will go into an office, they will do play therapy, a teen will go into an office and talk for 55 minutes, and then the caregivers only brought in for 5 minutes at the end to be told how the session went and how to support them in between sessions. Rarely is there family therapy. And if you think about it, a child is highly dependent on their ecosystem. They're dependent on their caregivers. They're dependent on the schools. They're dependent on their primary care physicians to identify what's going on. They're dependent on the social determinants that may impact their daily lives. And so as you're thinking about a family system, as a child psychiatrist, it's my job to really identify what are those things in that ecosystem that may be a trigger, and how do we address or educate that ecosystem so we can support the child that's really in the middle of everything. And so as we have evolved our solutions at Bend Health, where I have created it today, we take a purposeful family systems approach so we can really support the child at whole.
And how do you do that? This is through the work that you're doing now at Bend Health, right?
Yeah. So at Bend Health, we have a solution that's called collaborative care. So the first piece about it is that 92% of kids have a pediatrician. That's usually where these mental health symptoms typically present for someone to identify them. So that's the first piece. A pediatrician will identify a person and refer to us for care. The second piece is that as we are measuring, and it's important to measure the severity of mental health symptoms, we utilize standard scales, but we also measure how's the caregiver doing? Are they burnt out? Are they not sleeping? How's work going? How's their productivity? And we evaluate for social determinants of health. So we are identifying things in their ecosystem that may be a stressor. And then in terms of our ability to help, we do a lot of things. The first thing is if there's social determinant of health issues, we connect them to services. The next piece is that we bring that caregiver into the care. So they are part of sessions, or if it's a teen, they will have their own sessions to really talk about the family dynamics and ways that they can support them. We also have a digital experience with tools and techniques and different exercises that the caregiver can learn with the child so that they can really support them. And then the last piece is keeping everyone in the loop. If anyone knows mental health care, we have never done a really good job of coordinating care. We tend to be very siloed. But at Bend Health, what we try to do is keep everyone in the loop. So that means that we have given everyone someone who is called a behavioral care manager, whose sole focus is to coordinate care. So they reach out to the primary care physician to let them know what we're doing. They reach out to the school to keep them in the loop. They'll reach out to their therapist or anyone that's in their ecosystem so we can teach them how to support the child in different environments.
And so is there a range of different condition within, because mental health is so broad. There's the serious mental health. There's also more like the wellness, well-being. Do you cover all these kind of different treatment for all the children?
In fact, we try to. So we have multiple different solutions to address the full spectrum of need. We have coaching only. That is something that's really actually very effective for a lot of kids and teens. What they do is they identify a goal or an issue, and they will teach skills on how to address it. That's really good from everybody who has subacute needs. So it's more like wellness and early prevention and intervention, all the way up through maybe some mild symptoms that might be going on. We can then layer in therapy and psychiatry for those who have more moderate to severe symptoms. And then we also have things called neuropsychological testing, where if there's a complex concern, such as autism spectrum disorder or other issues, we can run an extensive battery of tests to really understand what is happening.
And help me understand a little bit, because I mean, we talk a lot about mental health. We hear about like the serious mental illness is like the schizophrenia, the bipolar, the clinical depression, and there's so many different personality disorder and all, you name it. And then there's, during the COVID, the teen, the adolescents, they're all facing mental health. What does that mean?
So there's a spectrum of different conditions that happen at different age groups, but are also really prevalent. So at a young age, there may be issues with attachment with their caregiver. Caregivers have their own stressors. Trust me, I'm a mom of two. We have our own stressors. We don't always do the best job that we can. And sometimes a caregiver may have depression, and so they can't connect as well with their children. So they will have what is called attachment issues, meaning that they don't always go to their caregiver and get the nurturing that they need in that moment. So that is what we do sometimes with the really young kids, like ages 1 to 2, which is helping that caregiver learn how to support their child, even though they don't have a diagnosis. When you get through ages 3 to 5, typically we'll start to see things like autism, ADHD, behavioral concerns, temper tantrums, those kind of things. But we also see depression, honestly, at age 5 or trauma-related concerns. As we go up, we can help with everything from, once again, ADHD to oppositional concerns to trauma to depression to anxiety. OCD has become quite prevalent after the pandemic. We also see eating concerns or body image issues increasing, and even things that are, maybe not usually identified, like internet or tech addiction, vaping concerns, and many other issues that are actually somewhat new if we think about what's popping up now versus maybe 10 years ago, that we're addressing through different care programs so we can address their primary needs.
This podcast is sponsored by Brown Rudnick's Global Life Sciences Group, a team of legal professionals that help life science companies, lenders, and investors around the world turn good science into good business. Learn more at brownrudnick.com. This podcast is also sponsored by Canon Quality Group. Canon Quality Group has been helping medtech startups set up quality management systems for over 10 years. If you're unsure when to get started with quality management in your startup, turn to the experts at canonqualitygroup.com.
Do you think, because sometimes when you think about mental health and you think about physical health, right? You break your knee because you fell and you got heart disease because you can see. But then when it comes to mental health, I think some people say certain conditions, you have the predisposed genetic. And like you're saying, many of them also come from environments. Sometimes when they have a caregiver who have the mental illness, it does affect the kids at a young age. What can we as a society do differently to improve the quality of life, especially for children who are unfortunate to be placed in a family that has a lot of challenges?
That is a big question, and I think actually a big question in the medical field in general. Part of the medical system, and you know this, is rewarded by being reactive or people not being well. We do not have a great payment system in the United States to help with prevention, so getting ahead of the concerns. And I think the same is true for mental health, which is until very recently, things like social emotional learning were not part of the curriculum in school. In addition to that, there was not much training for teachers. So I see some of that starting to change, where there are certain school districts where teachers are being taught on mental health concerns. They're being taught about cultural biases. Because unfortunately, sometimes if there is no understanding of mental health concerns, kids may be labeled as bad or disrespectful or lazy. And that's really not what's going on. It's actually a mental health concern or something that needs support, like a social determinant concern. I also think that we need to start thinking, especially in preventative care, around a mental health checkup, not just a physical that we get once a year. I know that we screen for anxiety and depression at our yearly physical, which is great. But mental health is much more than that. It's really, once again, understanding the family system, what is going on in their life, are there social determinant concerns, how much tech are they using? So I would love to, in the future, see the concept of a mental health yearly checkup. How are you doing? And then I also think that, as we have seen in the last several years, is that the consumer has started to be the driver of medical care. And that is very true in mental health, where we see many individuals seeking care through apps or online to get their own wellness solutions or therapy or even psychiatry services. So I think as we think about kids, it's very much the same. One is, how do we educate the people who see them every day? Because the truth of the matter is, it could be one person who notices that will change the life of that child. It's very true for me. My uncle noticed what was happening, and he was the one person that I was always able to turn to for help. And I think the same thing is true of a child. It doesn't need to be the parent who identifies what may be going on. It could be a teacher. It could be an after-school counselor. So really educating these individuals who are in their life on mental health so they know what they're looking for. And then second is really starting to help with prevention. Child mental health has not been something that the payment system has even really focused on. Typically, they focus on adults or the geriatric population. I think there's a growing interest in the pediatric mental health crisis. In fact, the Surgeon General has identified it as a pandemic and a crisis, which it is. But in turning our attention to that, we are needing the ability to think about different funding mechanisms to look at prevention in mental health, starting at a very, very young age, where mental health, to the point that you made, may not be something that you see on the surface, but impacts everything. Your brain and your head are connected to your body. If you're not well from a mental health perspective, you can't be well from a physical health perspective. It's kind of like going back to what you said. It's almost as if sometimes with the mental health concern, we're banging our knee against the wall over and over and over again. And finally, when it's super damaged, we say, fix it. Well, that's going to take a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you had maybe stopped banging your knee against the wall the first or second time, we can probably get you better faster. So it's the same sort of thing we need to think about mental health, which is as things happen in their environment, as they continue to have stressors and their mental health is not being addressed, we need to get it to it sooner so that they're not ending up in situations where they need someone like me, a psychiatrist, or ending up in the ER or worse yet, the inpatient units.
And I think there's a lot of destigmatizing happening, at least lately. I think when I was a kid, there's no such thing about mental health. Like, you feeling down, sure, everybody feeling down, who doesn't? And eventually it will go away and you just move on, life goes on. And I think there's also a challenge now that, I've seen among parents who, kids are struggling and they see a therapist that seems to be doing really well, but then they go every week and then you start wondering, like, when is this going to be over? Because it's almost like, how can you provide the tool to each individual that they can help manage their own care? I'm just thinking about many years ago, probably people don't talk about physical exercise. And I don't remember what point in the life everybody said, like, physical exercise is good for your health. I wonder if there will be that side of things too, mental exercise that people need to do in order to be healthy.
There's a lot to unpack in what you just said. So my husband, who is actually my co-founder, is from a small town in Wisconsin. And there's only 4,000 to 5,000 people. And we actually lived there for a short period of time. And I said, can I just open up a clinic here? I think that people may need it. And he said, no one's ever going to show up. And so I think that's been the benefit of virtual mental health services, which is you can seek care from the privacy of your own room. I've seen patients who are hiding in their closet, but at least they're giving me a call. But I do think that we have seen that kids and teens are teaching us that we should not have stigma against mental health concerns. We should talk about it. But part of the issue that I still see today is caregivers have stigma around their children seeking mental health care. They think they did something wrong. They think they did something wrong and they take it personally. And so one thing, if anything comes of us talking today, I just think that from a caregiver perspective, if your child needs help, you get them help. And it has nothing really potentially to do with what you did. And I also think as a parent, kids didn't come with a rule book. We are trying the best that we can. And sometimes we need extra help, and that's okay. So I think listen to your kids and your teens. They're actually pretty wise. Getting mental health treatment is really good. But the other piece too is people shouldn't necessarily be in therapy forever. And part of what's occurred sometimes in the mental health field is that people go to these sessions and they just talk. They're not actually doing evidence-based interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy or some other things. And these cognitive behavioral therapies are actually time-bound. They are supposed to be finite because what they're doing is they're teaching you skills. You're doing homework, just like in school, so you can practice it. You go back, you fine-tune. That's really what therapy should be, which is it's almost like going to see a physical therapist or having a fitness trainer. They teach you something, you go do it on your own, you come back and you fine tune. That's what therapy should be. And that's what we do at Bent Health. But really what that's trying to do is to get you better, to teach you what those warning signs are that you may relapse or get worse, and what are the techniques to keep that from happening. And then I think, as I said before, we need to work towards having things like coaching or wellness apps that we could then step down to continue to maintain these skills. Because just like physical fitness, you may be really fit one day because you're with your trainer, but if you stop working out for 6 months, probably not going to be so good. It's the same thing in mental health. If you don't practice these techniques every day, you won't be able to call on them when you really need them.
So for those out there, parents with kids, I mean, definitely, I'm not trying to promote bans, but I'm just saying that when your kids need to see a therapist, then do you work with therapists like, okay, how many sessions do you think we need to get these things done? And the kids need to like do the homework, because sometimes you never graduate, you've never done your homework either. So how do you make sure that the psychiatrist or the therapist also is a good teacher who can inspire the kids to do their homework? Otherwise, they'll
Absolutely.
be in school forever.
Well, it's true. Actually, being a good therapist or a good coach is just like being a good teacher. You have to motivate your students to want it, right? So that's why people talk about in mental health, one of the primary things that gets people better is rapport. It's that bond that you develop with your coach and your therapist. And from there, they can motivate you to learn the skills, practice the skills, etc. And then you're right, in child mental health, it's a little bit easier because we have a caregiver to also prompt it as well, as opposed to an adult. So for us, we've created multiple curriculum that have specific modules. So at the beginning, hey, we're going to do this care program for anxiety. It's going to be 4 to 6 months in length. We're going to get through these modules. When we're done, we're going to be good and we're going to step down. And there's that understanding from the beginning. Just like having a school syllabus, I think it's important in therapists to say, this is our care plan. Do you understand it? This is what we're going to do. And at the end, this is what we're expecting. But also measurement. So in mental health, we have not done a good job at measurement. Only 17% of mental health providers actually measure symptom severity. So many of you have probably heard of this thing called the PHQ-9 or the GAD-7. These are different measures that measure depression or anxiety. These are the measures that I'm saying that people don't use. So there is a big effort, especially at Ben Health, but I think just in general in the mental health field, which is to start measuring symptoms, both at baseline. So when you start, how severe are you? And then continuing to measure through the course of care, how are you doing? And if not getting better, modifying the care plan to actually get better. Because in the past, unfortunately, what we have relied on is, are you feeling better? Sure, maybe. Okay, great. We'll continue with what we're doing, right? You'll hear sometimes from parents, hey, how do you know that your child's medication is working? It's like, well, I think it's working. And that's what they take as the sign of improvement instead of actually using standardized measures to measure how they're doing. So I think we in the mental health field have been known as sort of a gray zone area of discipline because we don't have a lot of measurement. So we really need to make this effort towards getting to a discipline where we have measurement and we're truly measuring it over time so we can see what is the status of improvement of our patients.
In a way, this measurement, it's also is something that you ask the patient. With sure, there's a lot of different questions. I think we are not quite there. I think when it comes to like, if you take the statin, you do your blood cholesterol to check the blood, and that has become more objective, right? And so, do you think we are heading that direction in the mental health, or do you think this is something that is more like it takes a discipline for the providers to be measured in terms of whether the treatment is successful or not?
There's a lot of research in this area. There are tools such as EEGs, fMRIs, which are really costly devices to be able to see, do you have a response to this treatment? And we can clearly see that areas of the brain do change towards the better, and we can actually see if this is a response to a medication. Unfortunately, that is a very costly way of tracking improvement. It's very different than a blood test. Mm-hmm. So I think at least for the time being, unfortunately, we are stuck with these subjective measures. But I do think that there is definitely an effort towards getting to measuring different blood levels, being able to look at different biometric signs, such as how is your sleep? How are you eating? What's your activity level? Does your voice change? We know that as depression improves, the intonation, the actual pitch of your voice changes. So that is a biomarker of improvement. So I think this is a really exciting time. We're investigating a lot of different things that could really change the mental health industry for being a non-measurement based discipline to actually being a highly measured area of medicine.
And I knew based on your background and your interest, a lot of the work that you do want to measure it. And how do you instill that so that it's become a standard in the industry that is being measured?
That I think right now is a really tough question. So at Bend Health, it's part of our training. We train everyone who works at Bend Health. We also put it in the member app so that it's front and center. We explain as part of our treatment. I think to get to widespread measurement, though, is going to take some thinking. If we look, for example, at the insurance companies, there could be the potential of maybe paying more for a visit if they use measurement. The issue, though, is that we don't have enough mental health providers. So if an insurance company tries to mandate measurement, there's a huge possibility that those practitioners would no longer be on the insurance panel, accept that insurance, because many of them can be private practice, and then their network would actually shrink more. So there's a lot of anxiety around that. I think the other piece is, do we change it at the policy level? That's also really different, because what's the incentive, right? Because many individuals, the reality of mental health is they could open a private practice and be full tomorrow because the need is so great. So I think it's going to be a couple of things. I think it's going to be creative around financial models. We're going to have to get there. I think it's going to be leading the way with companies such as Bend and others towards having these value-based metrics, meaning, can you measure availability? Can you measure outcomes? And getting, potentially being accountable to those outcomes with their payment structures, with the insurance companies. But beyond that, I think, how are we going to communicate with other people without measurement? So this concept of coordination with primary care and with other practitioners is going to require some form of measurement to collaborate, so that everybody is essentially speaking the same language. So if we start to move towards a gold standard of collaboration and what that gold standard is, I think there's an opportunity, but we are well off, unfortunately, from that ideal feature right now.
I think it's also educating the consumer that they need to ask for the measurement. But I think that's also the challenge. Like, they need a therapist, they cannot find anybody, and they just go with anybody who's available, and they're willing to pay that $200 per hour. And then when they get out, it feels good. I was like, okay, then I keep just going back. So they don't really know that they need to demand that there's a measurement in place.
Right.
I don't know how to.
Incentives are not aligned. Yeah.
Right. So, but I want to, I know we are short on time already. I can talk a lot about this. I have so many questions. But I want to get your thought about, you're running a company now, in what are the lessons learned that, coming from where you are to start your own company, what was the lesson learned, that things that you did not expect, that things that you thought was harder turned out to be manageable, and things that you thought was easy turned out to be really hard to overcome?
Well, first piece is I co-founded my company with my husband. As we talked about, there are certain people in life that will set you on a trajectory. And he was actually part of the reason that I went into digital tech at all, which is, at the beginning of my career, he said, do you want to help 1,000 kids or do you want to help millions? And it's really this tech-enabled service concept that allows us to help as many people as possible. Also, I was VP of Health Services at Teladoc, and then I was Chief Medical Officer at Sanvelo. Both were digital health companies. And part of what I learned there is that delivering great care is important, but that collaboration was missing. So that was also part of the reason that One, I wanted to take care of kids and teens, which I was not doing at the other companies. And I also wanted to focus on collaboration. But one of the things that people frequently say is, well, how do you work with your husband? How does that work? It actually works really well. So we are a little bit yin and yang. He is black and white and very linear. I am very gray zone. So we do really well at balancing our different responsibilities. And I think that's important on any executive team or running a company. You need to be very clear on roles. Also, you need to be very clear on when is there a stop time. Because when you're running a company, there is no stop. You can never really run out of work to do. So you really got to think about yourself. And even if it's a 30-minute walk, it's worth it. The other piece, I think, is learning about how to interface with these different health system stakeholders. So we work with health systems, employers, and payers. These are all the main stakeholders in healthcare, but they're very, very different, and they have different incentives or things that they're looking for. So that is really tough when you're an early startup, which is who is your customer and what do they need? And if you have multiple customers who have multiple needs, that is really hard to take on and a huge challenge. So one of the big things I would say for any entrepreneur is don't bite off more than you can chew. Pick one problem, one channel, one solution, and then learn from there. What's been easier than I thought it would be? I think finding a great team of people who really get the mission of what we're trying to do. And I think if you can find a team that really aligns on the mission, everything else after that is gravy, because at the end of the day, the mission to help kids is what brings us together.
Mm. And so you mentioned earlier that collaborating, like bringing all different stakeholders together and through the work that you do at Ben Health. And how do you do that? Like, how do you bring, and then navigating, everybody has their different interests, like you're saying.
Yeah, so we actually deal with those three, but what we found is that there's a really interesting intersection between those three, which is where we thrive. So from a insurance payer perspective, they're really focused on access, getting people to care so they don't end up in the ER. For kids, where are they? They're actually at the health system level over here with the pediatricians, who we also contract with. So once again, you've got that intersection. And then employers are trying to pick the best solutions for their members, which are the employees and their dependents, so their families, and getting them access high quality services, but also meeting them where they're at. So once again, the health systems. So the interesting thing for us is that the health system at the pediatrician level is actually where we found the intersection. And then reversing many of the things around thinking about the ecosystem. So a child is frequently in their school. So for us, we can get releases of information and have school-based sessions. We didn't need to contract directly with schools. But once again, meeting that child where they're at really worked well, which is we can have the session there and then bill their insurance company or whatever is needed. So once again, I think it's really thinking about who is the client, right? Who's the patient that you're trying to help? And then thinking backwards, what are the different systems that touch this patient and that you can plug into?
Yeah, no, I think that is definitely harder than what you say, but I think that probably takes a lot of time and listening and observing. And so, one last question. What are the best advice that you were given as an entrepreneur?
One of the best things that I was told by a mentor is to not compromise on the clinical model. And that is hard in the tech industry, where sometimes there's a really big pressure about margins and scalability and all of those things. But what I have learned is that my ideal clinical model is what I designed for Ben Health, and I did not compromise on it. And what I have found is that because of that, we have become known as the best in the industry for mental health outpatient. The payment models are supporting our clinical model. The pediatricians want to plug into it. And so instead of having to fit our solution for, once again, each one of those channels, we were able to create the best clinical model that we could envision. And we are finding ways of those stakeholders supporting us to support the kids.
That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Thanks for doing all the great work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Health Technology Podcast. We want to thank our executive producer, Herminio Neto, and our podcast engineer, Andrew Rojek. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. The Health Technology Podcast is available on all major platforms.